Hello there. Welcome, once again, to Boring History for Sleep Stories. You're in the right place, where the past is softly lit, the stories drift like slow tides, and you are invited to relax into the gentle rhythm of history. Tonight, we're setting sail across the wide, warm waters of the ancient Mediterranean. You might imagine yourself aboard a wooden vessel, gently creaking beneath your feet, the salty wind brushing across your cheeks, and the sun hanging low over a horizon that glimmers with myth. You're drifting not just through water, but through time. Our journey this evening will explore a curious and quiet question. How did Greek sailors protect themselves from sea monsters? Not in fantasy. Not in drama. But in the calm, peculiar rhythms of real, everyday belief. This was a world where the boundary between reality and myth was softer than we can imagine. Where men who smelled of salt and pine pitch lit small offerings to invisible forces. Where shadows on the waves could be a whale or something else. We'll begin with their daily lives, the slow rhythm of oars and stars, the patient work of sailors. Then we'll explore specific stories from myth, the chilling beasts of legend. We'll uncover rituals, charms, and protective prayers, and we'll finish by looking at how the elite and scholars of Greece understood these tales from the safety of their villas and academies. So, lie back and allow your thoughts to drift. Let the present slip away. Imagine wood and water, stars and smoke. And prepare to sail calmly into the ancient sea, where monsters once stirred below. Picture yourself aboard a Greek merchant ship around the 5th century BCE. It's not a massive trireme of war, no, this is humbler. A round-bellied merchant galley, wide and slow, its deck just barely above the waves. It smells of pine tar, worn hemp, dried fish, and the faint tang of olives stored below. Your role is simple: row, wait, steer, watch. The sea is your road, your labor, and your quiet fear. These vessels, called hulkades, weren't built for battle. They had thick hulls to withstand storms, but little in the way of speed or defense. The crew might number 20, maybe 30 men. Each had his tasks: oarsmen who rowed in shifts, a helmsman at the tiller, a lookout near the bow, and a priest or elder who offered prayers when needed. The sun begins early. The rosy-fingered dawn, as Homer so often described it, peeks over the horizon. The men rise slowly, stiff from the night air, their beds no more than folded cloaks. Before setting off again, they gather near the mast. A small libation is poured, usually wine, sometimes oil, spilled carefully over the side into the water. It's for Poseidon, of course, but also for unknown things beneath the waves. They don't speak of them openly. But the older men, those who have sailed the open sea between Asia Minor and Italy, they glance at the horizon with quiet superstition. They tell stories in half-whispers. Of Scylla, the many-headed creature who lived near sharp rocks, though no one really knows where. Of Charybdis, a vast whirlpool that devours ships whole, but some say it's just a way to explain dangerous currents. And of things that have no name, that brush the bottom of the ship on windless nights. Even the most practical sailors, the ones who spit and mock fear, still keep charms tied to their belts or sewn into the seams of their tunics. A carved dolphin tooth, a piece of coral, a tiny bronze figurine. Some wear knotted cords blessed by a temple priest. Others mutter little rhymes or protective phrases as they cast off from shore. At sea, even reasoned men made space for mystery. Their tools were basic: a square sail, oars, a sounding line for depth. No compass. No sextant. Instead, they used the stars, and when clouds came, they relied on experience and instinct. They hugged the coast where they could. Venturing into open waters, like the central Aegean, was always risky. It was not just storms they feared, it was the deep itself. Many believed the sea was alive, not metaphorically, but literally. It was a being, old and moody, capable of kindness, or of devouring ships without trace. The Pharos lighthouse of Alexandria, centuries later, would guide many safely home. But in these earlier times, a simple beacon fire on a cliff might be the only hope of landfall. Life on the ship was slow, repetitive, and strangely intimate. The men worked together, cooked together, and sang rowing chants, low, rhythmic songs that helped synchronize the stroke of the oars. At night, the deck was quiet. The waves lapped, and sometimes, strange sounds came from the blackness. A spout of water. A sudden splash. A silhouette that vanished just as quickly. The older sailors knew not to look too long. And so, to protect themselves, they turned not just to tools, but to belief. They offered rituals before each voyage. Sometimes goats were sacrificed at a seaside temple. Sometimes, they cast small wooden effigies into the waves, shaped like fish or serpents, meant to draw away danger. These weren't dramatic rituals. No thunder. No prophecy. Just small, human gestures of caution in a world they didn't fully understand. And that's how it began. Every voyage, every journey across the Aegean or Ionian Sea, began not just with preparation of sail and food, but with a moment of respectful fear. Of quiet protection. Of belief in the unseen. As the ship creaked forward into morning light, the sailors settled into their rhythm. Eyes always on the horizon. And minds full of stories, of monsters that might be real. Now that we've gently stepped into the wooden shoes of an ordinary sailor, it's time to sail a little farther, not just across the sea, but deeper into memory. Memory, for the Greeks, was not separate from history. It was myth. And myth was truth in its own strange way. And perhaps no sailor, real or imagined, loomed larger in that mythical truth than Odysseus. You may remember his name. Odysseus, king of Ithaca. Not the strongest, nor the swiftest, but clever. Wily. The man who built the Trojan horse, and the man who took 10 long years to sail home afterward. His journey, told in Homer's Odyssey, is not a historical document in the modern sense. And yet, for the Greeks, it was deeply real, a kind of ancient travelogue between the known and the unknown. And for the sailors who whispered of sea monsters, it was a cautionary tale. Let's drift gently now into one of those tales. It begins quietly, as most sea stories do. Odysseus had already survived battles, betrayal, and the anger of gods. His ship sailed from Aeaea, the island of the enchantress Circe, and was headed back toward Ithaca. But Circe gave him a warning, one that chilled even this veteran mariner. To reach home, he would have to pass 2 perils. On one side, the monstrous Scylla. On the other, the deadly whirlpool called Charybdis. Let's begin with Scylla. She was said to be a creature once human, transformed by jealousy and magic. Now she dwelled in the cliffside, hidden in a shadowy cave above the narrow strait. Her body, Homer tells us, was festooned with 6 long necks, each ending in a snapping dog-like head. Her waist sprouted 12 writhing limbs, and her voice was a sound of puppies yelping, unsettling, not fearsome, but deeply unnatural. Sailors who passed too close to her cliffs would lose men without warning. Not the whole ship, just a few souls, plucked from the deck and dragged screaming into the stone. Odysseus, guided by Circe's counsel, chose to sail closer to Scylla, sacrificing a few men rather than risk losing everything to Charybdis. And Charybdis. She was not seen at all, only sensed. A great, open maw in the sea, sucking in water and spewing it out 3 times a day. Some scholars think this might have referred to the Strait of Messina, a narrow passage between Sicily and Italy known for dangerous currents and whirlpools. But for the Greeks, Charybdis was a creature. Not a force of nature, but a being. In between the two, Scylla and Charybdis, the strait was narrow. The sailor's path was a choice between losses, between known danger and unknowable catastrophe. The tale of Odysseus was told again and again across the Greek world, not just because it was heroic, but because it mirrored the sailor's own choices. Sail too close to rocks. You might be dashed against them. Sail too far from shore. You could vanish forever. And so, for the men at sea, Odysseus wasn't just a legend. He was a model. A reminder to plan carefully, to pay attention to the warnings of the gods, and, when in doubt, to sacrifice a little rather than risk everything. There were other stories, too. The Argonauts, led by Jason, were another band of seafarers who encountered strange things in their journey. They passed the Symplegades, clashing rocks that crashed together unexpectedly, threatening to crush their ship. Again, modern scholars wonder if this myth reflected hidden reefs or unpredictable currents. But for the ancient sailor, it was a living danger. To survive, the Argonauts released a dove. If the bird made it through safely, they would row at full speed and pray to the gods. They survived. Barely. There was also the sirens, whose beautiful songs lured sailors to wreck on rocky shores. Odysseus again faced them, but cleverly plugged his crew's ears with wax. He alone listened, tied to the mast, his ears open but his body restrained. Each of these stories became part of the mental map Greek sailors carried. Not just places on a chart, but emotional landmarks, where danger wore a face, where caution was wrapped in narrative. And these stories weren't just told by poets. They were carved onto pottery, painted on walls, whispered during stormy nights. A young sailor might carry a small clay tablet etched with the image of a siren or Scylla, not as decoration, but as a warning. The monsters were, in a way, a kind of wisdom. They weren't just enemies. They were lessons. Sail cautiously. Appease the gods. Be clever, not just brave. Accept small losses to avoid disaster. And always, always, remember that the sea is not just water. It holds stories, beings, and truths we may never fully grasp. For the ancient Greeks, that was enough to believe. Let's drift now into the quieter spaces of belief. Not the loud epics of Homer, nor the shouted commands aboard the ship, but the soft, almost private acts of faith that accompanied Greek sailors as they braved the open sea. In the ancient world, the boundary between religion, superstition, and daily habit was fluid. A sailor lighting a small fire before departure might not have called it a ritual, and yet, it was. Magic and religion were woven into the ropes and wood of the ship itself. So, how did Greek sailors protect themselves from the sea's dangers? How did they guard against the monsters of myth, the beasts of story, and the unknown shapes that stirred below? They turned to objects, words, and gestures. Simple things. Quiet things. Anchor amulets and protective tokens. Aboard many ancient ships, archaeologists have found tiny tokens tucked into the beams or hidden beneath deck planks. They are often small, just a few centimeters across, and made from clay, bone, bronze, or stone. Some are carved with dolphins, or hippocamps, seahorses, half fish and half horse. Others bear the image of a Gorgon's face, wide-eyed and grimacing, meant to ward off evil. These were not decorations. They were apotropaic, that is, designed to turn away harm. Much like how a child today might sleep with a lucky stuffed animal, sailors placed these tokens around the ship, near the mast, beneath the steering oar, or sewn into sailcloth. One common charm was the evil eye, a round, blue or black symbol with a central pupil, meant to reflect hostile glances back upon the sender. Even the act of painting an eye on the front of the ship, something common on Greek vessels, was more than art. It was meant to let the ship see to protect it from blinding dangers. Crystal ball words as protection. Protection also came in the form of spoken words, short chants, prayers, or whispered invocations. These weren't dramatic ceremonies, but small, rhythmic utterances, repeated before setting sail, when passing dangerous rocks, or when the sea grew eerily still. Sometimes, the words were personal. A sailor might whisper the name of his child as a form of grounding. Other times, they called on the gods. Poseidon, lord of the sea, whose trident could calm or shatter waves. Amphitrite, his queen, associated with the swaying rhythm of tides. Or even minor sea deities, nymphs and river spirits, nereids, said to swim beneath the surface and aid those in distress. And in rare inscriptions, we find what seem to be magical formulas, combinations of words not quite Greek, possibly older, handed down through generations. These were not meant to be understood. They were tools, chanted for protection, not comprehension. Some phrases were inscribed on scrolls or clay tablets and kept in small leather pouches tied to the waist or hidden among personal belongings. These were known as phylacteria, protective charms meant to defend against spiritual harm. Candle hash ritual offerings. Before a voyage, many sailors visited local shrines, not grand temples, but small sanctuaries near the harbors. There, they might leave offerings, a few coins, a carved shell, a pinch of incense. Some poured out libations, wine, honey, or oil, onto the ground or into the sea. These gestures were not meant to bargain with the gods, but to honor them, to show humility and awareness of one's smallness in the face of the sea. One recurring practice was the casting of lead tablets into the water, inscribed with protective spells or the names of monsters to be bound. These tablets have been found by underwater archaeologists, sometimes rolled into tubes, sometimes pierced with nails, a symbolic binding of danger. Occasionally, animals were sacrificed, small birds, fish, or goats, offered at the shore before departure. The blood was not taken lightly. It marked a request. Let us pass safely. Spare us from what swims below. Textiles and knots. Another layer of protection came in the form of textiles, cloths tied in specific ways, dyed certain colors, or marked with symbols. The color red was considered protective, a defense against the evil eye. Many sailors wore red sashes or scarves, or tied a red thread around their wrist or ankle. The thread might carry the scent of frankincense or myrrh, both thought to repel spirits. Knots, too, held meaning. A sailor's knot, tied in 3 precise loops, could be imbued with magical protection if done while reciting a specific phrase. Some knots were meant to be untied in emergency, releasing a burst of protective force, a kind of spiritual pressure valve. These practices were rarely written down. They lived in the muscle memory of older sailors, passed from hand to hand, voice to voice. The role of the ship's figurehead. Most Greek ships had a carved prow, often shaped like a bird, a serpent, or a woman's face. This was not decorative flair. The figurehead was a guardian, watching, guiding, and absorbing danger before it reached the crew. In times of fear, a sudden squall, a sighting of something strange in the water, the sailors might anoint the figurehead with oil, or speak directly to it, asking for guidance or protection. To modern minds, these rituals may seem like superstition. But for the men of the ancient sea, they were as real as the waves themselves. Each chant, each charm, each drop of oil or twist of string, it was all part of a living conversation with the forces around them. They weren't trying to control the sea. They were simply trying not to be forgotten by it. Let's climb now, softly, from the docks and decks to the higher terraces of the ancient Greek world. Imagine yourself walking slowly through a colonnaded courtyard. White marble columns gleam under the late morning sun. The voices here are not coarse or hurried. They murmur in measured tones, echoing between polished walls. This is the world of philosophers, of wealthy merchants, and of the educated elite. These are men who rarely sailed far, and if they did so with plenty of servants, protections, and an eye always fixed on the shore. To them, the sea was not a daily risk. It was a subject for contemplation. And its monsters? A curiosity, a puzzle, or sometimes just an embarrassment. Philosophers and the rational sea. As early as the 6th century BCE, thinkers like Thales of Miletus began to challenge older ways of thinking. Thales famously declared that everything originated in water, but not in a mystical sense. He was seeking a rational principle, a way to explain the world using natural elements rather than divine figures. For him, and for many who followed, the idea of Scylla or Charybdis as literal creatures was unsatisfying. Instead, they sought explanations in natural phenomena. Charybdis became a metaphor for whirlpools or strong tides. Scylla was interpreted as a dangerous cliff or a misunderstood rock formation. The philosopher Democritus, known for his atomic theory, dismissed mythical beasts entirely. To him, sea monsters were nothing more than stories used to discipline the ignorant, metaphors to keep sailors cautious, much like how parents tell children not to wander too far into the woods. Plato, meanwhile, took a different approach. He did not reject myth outright. He saw it as a vehicle for truth, not literal, but allegorical. In his dialogues, Plato used the sea often as a symbol of chaos, of transformation, of the boundary between the seen and the unseen. One of his lesser-known dialogues, the Timaeus, even explores the nature of the ocean as a cosmic barrier, the edge of human understanding. Sea monsters, then, could represent the limits of knowledge, the things just beyond reason's reach. And yet, even these thinkers, for all their learning, did not fully let go of caution. Aristotle, one of the most rational minds of the ancient world, wrote extensively about marine life. He catalogued fish, described reproduction in aquatic creatures, and analyzed the shapes and behaviors of sea animals. But he also acknowledged that the sea hid things. He admitted, with rare humility, that many creatures were too strange, too deep, too rarely seen to be fully understood. He wrote of sea creatures with strange forms, octopuses, anglerfish, giant eels, and left open the possibility that some of the more fearsome tales may have a kernel of truth. So even in the clean, logical world of philosophy, the sea still shimmered with uncertainty. Wealthy Greeks and their ambivalent beliefs. Among the upper classes of Athens, Corinth, and Rhodes, belief in sea monsters was complicated. Many aristocrats wanted to appear rational and sophisticated. They attended public debates, hosted traveling scholars, and made donations to philosophical schools. And yet, when it came time to send their ships to sea, whether carrying grain, marble, or slaves, they still consulted priests and oracles. Some paid to have blessings performed over their ships. Others hired diviners to read signs in the wind or interpret dreams before a voyage. A merchant might laugh at tales of Scylla over dinner, and then quietly place a Gorgon charm beneath his pillow before bed. This contrast was not hypocrisy. It was the reality of living in a world where science and superstition coexisted, without conflict. They didn't always believe in monsters as physical creatures, but they believed in omens, in fate, in the power of fear to shape reality. And when a ship went missing, when its sails failed to return and its cargo was lost to the deep, they didn't ask for meteorological reports. They asked what god had been offended, or what protection had been neglected. Some even built private shrines to Poseidon within their homes, small marble altars tucked in garden corners or inside courtyards. There, they lit oil lamps and offered bits of fish or bread, not with loud proclamations, but with quiet hope. Educated doubt and private fear. In letters and personal writings, we catch glimpses of the private thoughts of the educated. One surviving letter, attributed to a scholar in Rhodes, laments the loss of his brother's trading ship. He writes, "There are no monsters, I am told by my peers. But something dragged him under. And I fear that reason has no name for it." Such reflections were not unusual. Educated men prided themselves on skepticism, but they were not immune to grief, nor to the whispers that travelled up from the docks. It was easy to be rational on dry land, with a scroll in hand and the safety of walls. But out there, where the stars turned above a featureless black, where the sea spoke in creaks and groans, doubt returned. So while philosophers wrote calmly about metaphors and tides, and merchants debated trade routes and taxes, they still listened, quietly, cautiously, when an old sailor warned of something seen near the cliffs, or a song heard in the fog. Even among the most learned Greeks, the sea remained half-known. And so they lived with this gentle contradiction. A world that was rational, and a sea that never quite was. Imagine now a quiet harbour town, somewhere along the craggy coast of ancient Euboea or perhaps the Peloponnesian shoreline. It's early morning. The waves roll softly against the docks. The air is laced with the familiar scents of salt, fish, oil, and warm bread. A bell rings softly from a nearby shrine. Seagulls cry lazily overhead. This is not the ship. This is the shore. And here, too, the fear of sea monsters was not just myth, but part of the architecture of daily life. From here, fathers, sons, husbands, and hired crews set out to sea. And from here, wives, mothers, children, and priests watched the horizon, offering prayers not just for the weather, but for protection from the deep. Houses hashed the towns that looked to the sea. Across the Greek world, towns like Piraeus, Delos, Chalcis, and Corinth grew as trading and fishing centers. Some were bustling ports with thousands of residents, others mere clusters of huts and stone houses lining narrow coves. No matter the size, each town had its own rhythm, tied intimately to the sea. Boats left at dawn and returned by dusk, their hulls low with salted fish, pottery, or imported grain. But in between, the shoreline was filled with its own quiet rituals, gestures of hope and fear. Some women would walk to the edge of the docks and cast small bouquets of herbs into the water. Dill, rosemary, fennel. Others tied ribbons to driftwood, setting them afloat toward the horizon. Children were taught to recognize good omens. A dolphin near the shore was lucky. But if the sea was too quiet, if the gulls did not cry, if the dogs barked toward the waves at night, that was something else. It wasn't just Poseidon they feared. It was what he allowed to swim beneath him. Shinto shrine hashed temples and sea shrines. Near nearly every coastal town was a temple, sometimes modest, sometimes grand, dedicated to a god or goddess of the sea. The most famous of these was the Temple of Poseidon at Cape Saunion, perched high on a rocky promontory, looking out over the vast Aegean. Sailors could see it from miles away, its marble columns gleaming like the ribs of a giant beast. But many smaller shrines dotted the coast as well, to Amphitrite, Poseidon's consort, to Leucothea, a mortal woman who became a sea goddess and protector of shipwrecked sailors. Even to Nereus, the old man of the sea, gentle and wise. These temples were not places of frenzy or dramatic sacrifice. They were places of rhythm, where offerings were made with calm precision. A jar of oil. A string of fish. A carved shell placed carefully on a stone ledge. Each offering a wordless plea, let them return. In larger sanctuaries, priests performed libations using sacred water mixed with sea salt, pouring it onto the steps or into the tide itself. Sometimes ceramic tablets were inscribed with the names of ships or captains, left as records, petitions, or thank yous when voyages ended safely. And occasionally, statues were lowered into the sea, usually of dolphins, bulls, or abstract forms. These were not lost, they were given, offerings cast into the depths, never meant to be retrieved. Festivals of the Sea. Every year, port towns held festivals to honor their maritime gods. Some were solemn, like the Poseidon, where oxen were sacrificed and oaths renewed. Others were more joyful, filled with dancing, wine, and the floating of lanterns down rivers and into the sea. These festivals served both civic and spiritual functions. They reminded the people that they were part of a larger, unpredictable system. The sea gave, and the sea could take. During these times, even skeptical citizens played along. Even the richest merchants lit a candle. Even the philosophers stood quietly as prayers were spoken in old, half-remembered dialects. Children heard stories of half-seen shapes in the water, long shadows with eyes. Of fishermen who went too far and returned mute. Of statues found on beaches, covered in seaweed, with no explanation. And these tales weren't told to scare. They were told to root everyone in humility. To remember that what lay beneath the waves was older than them all. Scales hash laws, customs, and the fear of the deep. In some cities, local laws even reflected this belief. It was common for ships to be ritually named, and for captains to undergo blessing ceremonies before their first voyage. Certain dates were avoided for departure, days considered unlucky, often linked to previous shipwrecks or strange occurrences at sea. One document from Rhodes, preserved in fragmentary inscriptions, mentions a fine for speaking ill of Poseidon within earshot of the harbor. Not just blasphemy, but bad luck, words thought to summon misfortune. Even in trade contracts, clauses sometimes included exceptions for acts of god or monster, phrased in more legal terms, of course, but still referencing the lurking unknown. And when disaster did strike, when a ship failed to return, it was common for families to commission small funerary shrines near the water. They bore no body, only symbols, a helmet, an oar, a piece of broken pottery. These became places of remembrance, and of warning. The next time a child passed, they would be told. That is where your uncle was remembered. He met something in the deep. And so, on land, just as at sea, the people of Greece lived alongside the myth. Not clinging to it. Not shouting it. But quietly, respectfully, building it into the fabric of their towns, their laws, their prayers, their hopes. And always, always, watching the water. As we ease into this next chapter of our quiet voyage, imagine the gentle sway of a trireme at anchor in a still cove, the moonlight casting a shimmer over dark, glassy waters. The oars are silent, the sails furled, and the only sounds are the soft creaking of wood and the rhythmic lapping of waves against the hull. It is the kind of night that might lull even the most vigilant sailor into a calm slumber, yet below the surface, in the minds of those aboard, ancient fears stirred. While Greek sailors developed many tools and techniques to survive on the high seas, some of their most enduring protections were not physical at all. These were the protections of belief, symbols, prayers, rituals, and talismans that held the power, in their minds, to guard them against unseen creatures in the deep. Let us begin with the symbols that adorned their ships. Wooden figureheads were commonly mounted to the prow of Greek ships, often in the shape of eyes. These weren't mere decoration. They were called oculi, and sailors believed they allowed the ship to see where it was going, especially in dangerous or monster-filled waters. Some depicted protective deities, like Athena, who was thought to bring wisdom and tactical advantage in all things, even at sea. Others bore likenesses of dolphins or lions, creatures admired for their strength and agility, intended to frighten away whatever lay beneath the waves. Inside the ship, it wasn't uncommon to find smaller symbols carved into beams or painted onto shields and oars. Spirals, tridents, and the image of the Gorgon's head, especially that of Medusa, were popular. The Gorgon's visage, with its petrifying gaze, was thought to ward off evil spirits. Some captains would even hang small icons wrapped in cloth or leather under the steering oar, believed to be touched by the favor of Poseidon himself. Beyond symbols, sailors practiced rituals before setting sail, rituals passed down from older generations, repeated with solemn reverence. At the beginning of each voyage, a small sacrifice was often made at port. This might be as simple as a few drops of wine poured into the harbor, or as elaborate as the burning of incense and recitation of hymns. These acts were more than ceremonial. They were vital psychological assurances, a pact with the gods, an invocation of protection. The belief was that if you offered the sea its due, it might leave you unbothered. Sometimes, sailors made offerings specifically to sea deities feared more than loved. Forces, the primordial sea god sometimes associated with monstrous offspring, was occasionally invoked in hushed tones. To offer a few salted olives or a piece of bread to the waves was a way of saying, "We acknowledge your realm, let us pass in peace." These practices were not just observed at the beginning of voyages. During journeys, especially when the crew sensed unease in the wind or unexpected calm, additional offerings might be made. A silver coin tossed into the sea. A whispered prayer under the breath. Some crews would even sing low chants during the darkest night watches, their voices almost inaudible, meant to calm themselves and the spirit of the sea simultaneously. One such practice involved knots. Sailors carried cords with complex knots, sometimes 3, sometimes 7. Each knot represented a prayer or wish. When danger loomed, a knot would be untied, symbolically releasing the prayer into the wind and sea. This practice, often linked to Airless, the keeper of winds, was also used to control weather, but it blended seamlessly with the hope of fending off monstrous forces lurking below. Curiously, certain herbs were believed to hold protective powers against sea monsters and ill omens. Mariners would tuck sprigs of thyme, laurel, or even garlic into the folds of their garments or into the ship's storage compartments. These weren't chosen randomly. Laurel, sacred to Apollo, was thought to bring clarity and vision. Garlic, pungent and humble, had long been considered a ward against evil spirits. It wasn't uncommon for garlic bulbs to hang near the helm or under the captain's bench, not just for provisions, but for protection. In times of storm or when a crewman claimed to have seen something unnatural in the water, perhaps a dark shape or glowing eyes in the depths, the ship would often be ritually cleansed. This involved sprinkling seawater over the deck while invoking the gods, or even burning aromatic herbs if conditions allowed. But one of the most fascinating practices, particularly in longer sea journeys, was the construction of small shrines aboard the ship. These were often temporary and made of whatever was on hand, stones collected from shore, seashells, bits of cloth dyed with saffron or ochre. Placed in a quiet corner of the ship, usually near the mast or by the cargo hold, these little shrines served as mobile temples. Offerings were left daily. Sometimes a crew member would keep a log of dreams or omens, written or spoken aloud, interpreting signs as the voyage progressed. It wasn't superstition in the modern sense, at least not to them. These practices were practical tools in the sailor's mental arsenal. When facing unpredictable seas, unseen predators, and the ever-present possibility of never returning home, the rituals and symbols became a form of emotional ballast. They grounded the sailors, helping them feel some sense of control over a world dominated by chaos and chance. And in that deeply human need for assurance, we see how ancient Greek sailors, so distant from us in time, and yet so close in their fears, built spiritual armor for their journeys. Armor made not of bronze or iron, but of prayer, memory, and hope. As the ship gently rocks once more under starlit skies, we begin to leave behind the flickering lights of incense and the carved symbols of warding. Ahead, on the horizon, looms the next chapter in our maritime journey, one not of sailors, but of storytellers, philosophers, and dramatists who gave form to the monsters they feared, anchoring them in myth. As we continue drifting along the gentle current of ancient Greek seafaring life, our course now turns toward the spiritual, the rich and reverent world of religion that accompanied every Greek sailor on his voyage. For to sail in the ancient world was never a purely physical endeavor. The sea was not merely a body of water, it was a realm of divine powers, inhabited by gods, spirits, and entities that required respect, appeasement, and at times, delicate negotiation. And so, woven into the daily rhythm of maritime life were countless rituals, offerings, prayers, and sacred practices, all intended to shield the ship and her crew from misfortune, monsters, and divine wrath. Imagine yourself once more aboard a modest merchant vessel, the wooden deck creaking gently beneath your sandaled feet. The sail billows overhead, catching a soft morning breeze as the coastline recedes behind you. Before the voyage even began, you and your companions made your way to the local temple. Perhaps one devoted to Poseidon, god of the sea, or to a protector such as Apollo or Athena. There, in the hush of early dawn, oil was poured, incense burned, and prayers spoken in voices lowered out of reverence. A priest, robed in white, would offer a blessing, perhaps casting barley or bits of salted bread into the waves, sanctifying your departure. This was no idle superstition, no empty tradition. The Greeks believed that the sea, vast and wild, was ultimately governed by divine will, and just as the gods could grant calm seas and favorable winds, they could just as easily summon tempests, send monsters from the deep, or curse a voyage with endless misfortune. To sail was to enter the domain of Poseidon, a deity known for his power, but also for his quick temper and demand for honor. Thus, rituals of protection were considered essential, not optional. A journey undertaken without them was a journey marked by arrogance. And arrogance, in Greek thought, inevitably invited nemesis, or divine retribution. Among the most common rituals was the libation, the pouring out of wine or oil into the sea. This small act of sacrifice was a sign of piety, a way to acknowledge the sovereignty of the gods and seek their favor. Sailors might perform a libation before setting sail, when entering a new harbor, or when passing dangerous waters. These acts were not performed hastily, but with solemnity and care. The liquid would swirl and mix with the sea, a symbolic offering that united human gesture with divine presence. Sometimes, sacrifices were more elaborate. In critical moments, before a long voyage, or during a storm, sailors might offer animals, such as a ram or goat, to Poseidon or another sea god. These ceremonies might take place at sea, but more often they were conducted on shore before departure. Temples dedicated to Poseidon were common in port cities and along the coasts. Some, like the famed temple at Cape Saunion, perched dramatically above the waves, where sailors could offer prayers and gaze out over the waters they were about to cross. Alongside Poseidon, other gods played important roles in maritime protection. Apollo, god of prophecy and light, was believed to guard against unseen threats and offer guidance. His oracles were often consulted before dangerous voyages, especially military expeditions. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy, was a favorite of Athenian sailors, who believed her influence extended to the discipline and coordination needed on long-sea missions. Even minor deities and spirits, such as the Nereids, daughters of the sea, were invoked in hopes of smooth sailing. There were also sea nymphs, river gods, and daimons believed to inhabit specific stretches of water. Some of these spirits were benevolent, others, less so. Local fishermen and coastal dwellers would often share tales of where the waters were haunted, where sacrifices had failed, or where sailors had vanished without a trace. Maps might mark dangerous straits not only for their currents, but for their spiritual reputation. Interestingly, the idea of sea monsters was often linked with religious punishment. A monstrous creature, whether imagined as a kraken-like beast or a serpentine terror, might be understood not just as a physical threat, but as a sign of divine disfavor. Thus, rituals were performed not only to prevent storms but to keep monsters at bay, or to banish those that had already appeared. The Greeks believed that piety could protect not only the soul, but the ship itself. In more intimate settings, sailors often carried personal charms or amulets for protection. These might take the form of carved symbols, tiny figurines, or knots and cords believed to hold protective power. One common motif was the evil eye, meant to deflect malevolent forces and misfortune. Some even wore small images of the gods, or kept miniature altars on board, a reminder that the sacred was never far away, even amid the salt and spray of the open sea. Songs and hymns, too, were part of this spiritual armor. Crews would chant as they rowed or worked the sails, their voices rising in rhythmic unity. Some of these chants were prayers in disguise, calls to the gods for strength and protection, wrapped in melody and repetition. The rhythm itself was soothing, a kind of liturgical lull, reminding sailors of their place within a greater cosmic order. It is also worth noting the role of dreams and omens. A dream of drowning or sea monsters before a voyage was considered a dire warning, and such signs were taken seriously. A sudden change in bird flight, a strange shadow in the water, or a bizarre cloud formation, all might be interpreted as a message from the gods. In these moments, a sailor might fall to his knees in prayer, or call for an impromptu sacrifice, hoping to change the course of fate. And so, the sacred and the seafaring were never truly separate. Every journey was a spiritual crossing, every safe return a kind of divine favor. The monsters of the sea were not just creatures of the deep, but expressions of cosmic imbalance, reminders that humans, no matter how skilled, were never truly in control of the waters they traversed. Only through devotion, humility, and careful ritual could balance be maintained, and the voyage completed. As we leave behind this segment of sacred rituals and spiritual protection, we'll drift next into a realm of interpretation and imagination. In the following segment, we'll explore how Greek thinkers, philosophers, poets, and early scientists tried to understand the sea and its mysteries. Were the monsters real, or were they metaphors? Could nature explain the terrors of the deep? Settle in and let your thoughts gently float onward as we move from sacred belief to speculative wisdom in segment 8. As the gentle hush of waves carries us forward, we leave the open sea behind, at least for a moment, and drift instead into the bustling harbors of ancient Greece. Imagine yourself walking slowly along a sun-warmed stone quay in a city like Piraeus, Rhodes, or Corinth. These port cities were the beating hearts of maritime commerce, but they were also places where stories flowed like water, from sailor to merchant, from child to elder, from myth to memory. Here, nestled between nets hung out to dry and crates packed with amphorae of olive oil, the conversations took on a rhythm of their own. And within those rhythms were whispers, soft, persistent, filled with caution. Tales of monsters didn't stay on the ship. They flourished here, too, in the salty air of the docks, where men gathered to mend sails or share wine. For Greek sailors, the harbor was not just a place of respite. It was a space of preparation and negotiation, with fellow seafarers, with merchants, and often, in their own quiet ways, with the supernatural. Before setting sail, many would visit the temples near the shore. Offerings were made to Poseidon, of course, but also to lesser-known sea deities, Nereus, the gentle old man of the sea, Glaucus, the transformed fisherman-turned-sea god, and the Thetis, the shape-shifting mother of Achilles. These visits were acts of faith, but also of protection. A way to feel grounded before returning to the unpredictable embrace of the Aegean. And in these same temples or nearby shrines, sailors might purchase or request the crafting of talismans, small, often simple objects meant to guard against misfortune. A knotted cord, infused with prayers. A carved shell with markings said to deter sea serpents. Bits of bone or driftwood etched with symbols handed down for generations. These were not just superstitions, they were comfort, reminders that one did not sail alone. The marketplaces, too, teemed with sellers who traded more than just olives or salted fish. There were those who claimed to sell monster charms, amulets created by those reputed to have seen the beasts and survived. Whether these vendors were charlatans or true believers, it scarcely mattered. In a world where maps marked unknown waters with sea dragons, the mere idea of preparation brought peace of mind. Stories were the true currency of these places. You might overhear a weathered mariner explaining to a wide-eyed youth how he narrowly escaped a beast with burning eyes and teeth like bronze, only to later, in a nearby tavern, hear another sailor scoff and say the beast was nothing more than a shadow cast by the moon on choppy waters. Still, none could deny the shared vocabulary of fear. Sea monsters were not just creatures of the deep. They were metaphors for all that was uncontrollable. Storms, illness, betrayal, shipwreck. They embodied the ever-present danger of the unknown, made tangible by teeth and scales and snarling eyes. And in every harbor, no matter how large or small, these fears took form in the stories told over wine, or sung in sea shanties at dusk. Some tales spoke of monsters tamed, or at least respected, by sailors who knew the ancient codes. A whispered blessing before throwing out the nets. A carefully timed pause before crossing a certain line of the coast. Such actions, seemingly small, were believed to build favor with the sea's hidden rulers. They became ritual. And even as rational thought began to rise with the philosophers of Athens and the naturalists of later generations, these practices persisted. The philosopher might debate the nature of the kraken, but the fisherman still tied 3 knots in his net to ward it off. This duality of reason and ritual defined much of Greek maritime culture. In the same port city you might find a man reciting Homer's verses, describing Scylla's 6 ravenous heads, while another man, not 10 steps away, carved a small trident into the wood of his boat for luck. And neither would think the other strange. As the evening sun sank low beyond the masts and rooftops, the port quieted into a hush. Boats swayed gently in their moorings. The smell of brine, tar, and roasting fish hung in the air. And in the fading light, the stories continued, passed from mouth to ear like an inheritance. Monsters of the deep, some said, were not to be feared so long as one respected the sea, its creatures, and its moods. In this calm, shared understanding, protection took on many forms: ritual, story, charm, prayer. And in every harbor, the sailors held close to those protections as they prepared, once again, to leave the safety of the known and drift into the mysteries that lay beyond the horizon. Let's now gently make our way from the chatter of dockside markets and the scent of salt and tar, and begin to explore something even more elusive: the strange maps, mythical islands, and tales of sea beasts passed down in parchment and ink. Our journey continues. As the winds carry us from the echoing harbors of ancient Greece and the whispered tales of dockside lore, we drift into the realm of parchment, ink, and imagination, a space where the sea was not just measured by distance and depth, but by danger and the unknown. Here, we explore a fascinating chapter in the story of sea monsters, their place on maps, and how geography, myth, and fear intertwined in the minds of ancient cartographers. Imagine, for a moment, standing before an enormous hand-drawn map stretched across a stone table, the papyrus yellowed with age. The coastlines are delicately outlined. Mountains are sketched as neat triangles. Rivers curl like blue threads through the terrain. But out at sea, far from the well-known ports and familiar islands, there, the imagination roamed free. Greek maps were not quite like modern ones. While practical charts were developed over time, particularly by the later Hellenistic seafarers, many early maps were deeply symbolic. They did not simply record what was seen, they expressed what was believed. And in those vast, blank spaces where no Greek had yet sailed, monsters waited. Ancient Greek cartographers such as Anaximander and Hecataeus attempted to chart the world as they understood it, often drawing from a blend of direct observation, sailor testimony, and inherited myth. The known world, the oikoumene, was placed at the center, often encircled by the great river Oceanus, which marked the boundary between the familiar and the unfathomable. Beyond that boundary, reality thinned. And so, in the corners of these maps, sometimes quite literally, illustrations would appear. A serpent coiled around a ship. A creature with the torso of a man and the tail of a fish. A head rising from the waves, ringed in jagged teeth. These monsters were not drawn with careless exaggeration. They were messages. Warnings. Here be dragons, as later cartographers would famously write, though the Greeks might have said, here dwell the Phorcides, the children of primordial sea gods. These visual representations served a powerful purpose. They acknowledged uncertainty. For the ancient Greeks, the world beyond the familiar was a liminal space, neither fully real nor wholly imagined. The monsters on the map symbolized not just creatures, but consequences. The price of venturing too far. The chaos that might lie beyond the gods' watchful gaze. In some maps, strange islands appear, floating jewels amid the endless blue. These lands, often rumored by returning sailors or hinted at in tales passed from Phoenician traders, were given names and attributes. Some were said to be home to cannibals. Others, to sirens whose songs could twist the minds of men. There were lands where the sun never set, or where the air was thick with poisonous mist, or where sea monsters ruled not from beneath the waves, but above them, walking the shorelines and dragging away the careless. Such places may never have existed in a geographical sense. But in the minds of sailors and scholars alike, they were vividly real. What's even more remarkable is how these ideas persisted. Even as Greek thinkers like Eratosthenes began calculating the Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy, and others created more precise nautical charts, the monsters never quite disappeared. Rationality and fear coexisted, two strands of thought, winding together like twin ropes securing a ship. Many of these monster depictions drew inspiration from Homeric tradition. Consider the legendary island of Thrinacia, home to the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios, where divine punishment came in the form of shipwreck and death. Or the map-bound markers of Scylla and Charybdis, two sea hazards personified as monstrous threats, one a six-headed devourer of men, the other a gaping whirlpool that could swallow entire ships. These hazards were real enough to fear, but their monstrous forms made them unforgettable. To a sailor unfolding a map in a flickering oil-lit cabin, these symbols mattered. They marked more than geography, they marked experience. A spot where a ship vanished without a trace. A location where strange lights were seen dancing on the horizon. A coastal stretch where no birds flew, and no fish swam. Such anomalies demanded explanation, and monsters, in all their terrible glory, provided one. The mythology that bled into these maps didn't just serve as ornamentation. It acted as a guide, offering not only warnings, but sometimes advice. In certain texts, scholars speculated about where one might be safe from these threats. Avoiding particular latitudes. Keeping to certain shipping lanes. Making the correct offerings at sea temples before passing a dreaded strait. Of course, it wasn't only fear that animated these drawings. There was also awe. Wonder. The ancient Greeks were endlessly curious. The creatures on their maps were, in some ways, invitations, beckoning the brave to venture farther, to confront what had never been seen, to return with tales that might redraw the edges of the known world. And slowly, through these tales and explorations, the maps did change. The monsters were pushed farther outward. What was once the edge of the world became part of its center. But the sea never fully surrendered its mysteries. And even the most rational cartographer, scratching lines across a parchment sea, likely felt a thrill, or perhaps a shiver, when sketching a tiny, stylized serpent in the farthest corner. So, as we gently roll this imaginary scroll of ancient geography closed, let us remember, the monsters on Greek maps were not mere decorations. they were placeholders for human limits. For every question that could not yet be answered. And for the quiet truth that, even in the age of reason, there are always places where myth and memory entwine. Let us now set our course for deeper, darker waters, into the shipwreck tales and strange survivor stories that blurred the lines between hallucination and horror. Our voyage continues. Now, let us drift once more onto the water, to the rhythmic creak of oars and the gentle clap of waves against a wooden hull. Picture yourself aboard a Greek merchant vessel, the wind softly filling the linen sail above you, the horizon stretching endlessly in a haze of blue and golden light. Life on the sea, while treacherous in its own right, was also guided by an intricate system of beliefs, routines, and unspoken customs, many shaped by a desire to avoid the wrath of the sea and its imagined creatures. Greek sailors were not simply at the mercy of the waves. They followed routines steeped in tradition and superstition. These daily habits served both as practical necessity and psychological reassurance, quieting the ever-present fear of what might be lurking beneath the surface. Some of these behaviors had grown so deeply rooted that even the most skeptical sailors performed them without question. Whether out of habit, or out of hope that these small acts might make the difference between returning home or vanishing without a trace. One of the first routines was an early morning ritual performed before setting sail. Sailors might offer a quiet libation to Poseidon, or whisper a small prayer, pouring a few drops of fresh water, or sometimes oil, into the sea. The gesture, small though it was, symbolized respect and a plea for safe passage. It was believed that a satisfied sea god might be more inclined to steer sea monsters away, or calm the restless waves they swam within. Sailors often wore small charms or amulets as protection. These were usually carved from bone, shell, or sometimes bronze, depicting images like the trident of Poseidon, the head of Medusa, or even symbols borrowed from Egyptian or Phoenician cultures encountered through trade. These tokens were not mere ornaments, they were shields against the unseen. When a voyage was especially perilous, or when tales of nearby sea monster sightings reached the crew, sailors would double their efforts, rubbing the amulets, muttering incantations, or even refusing to sleep on their backs, believing it invited dark dreams or malevolent spirits. Meals at sea, while meager, also became moments of silent ritual. Bread was often broken with solemnity, and a small portion might be tossed into the sea, a gift to whatever entities lived below. Silence was sometimes observed during meals, especially on open water, as it was believed that loud voices might stir up unwanted attention. Even laughter could be frowned upon on certain days, especially if it was believed a bad omen had recently occurred. And then there were the birds. Birds, especially gulls and albatrosses, were seen as omens. If birds followed a ship, sailors might feel reassured, believing land or favorable weather was near. But if birds flew in strange patterns, or if they disappeared altogether, a quiet unease would settle over the deck. Sailors believed that sea monsters disturbed the natural flow of the world. If the birds vanished, it might be because something ancient and wrong had risen beneath them. In moments of thick fog, when the sea stretched blank and grey on all sides, these routines grew even more vital. The fog was feared not just for hiding reefs and enemy ships, but for cloaking the very monsters of the deep. Stories abounded of ships disappearing into fogbanks, never to be seen again. During such passages, captains might demand silence from the crew, the oars pulled gently and slowly, as though even the noise of splashing water might awaken some slumbering horror. Another fascinating routine involved the careful treatment of ropes and sails. These were not just tools of navigation, but were believed by some to have personalities or spirits. To allow ropes to become tangled, or to leave a sail half-furled, was thought to insult the ship's spirit, or worse, provoke bad luck. A tidy ship was a protected ship, and so time was always found, even in the harshest storms, to maintain order and cleanliness. There was a quiet belief that monsters, like chaos, thrived in disorder. Occasionally, a ship would be fitted with a painted eye on its prow, a tradition that can still be seen in some Mediterranean fishing boats today. These eyes were said to help the ship see the danger ahead, guiding it away from reefs, pirates, or mythical beasts. They also served as an unblinking warning to whatever might approach the vessel from beneath. Sailors also observed certain dates and tides with caution. Lunar phases were tracked not only for navigation but as signals of supernatural activity. A full moon, reflecting off a mirror-smooth sea, might evoke stories of shimmering serpent-like beasts rising in the distance. On such nights, men might sleep with one hand on their daggers, or not sleep at all. It's worth noting that despite the dangers, life on the ship had its own rhythms and comforts. The crewmates became a kind of family. Tales were told not just to frighten, but to bond. Laughter, though rare, was shared when storms passed, or when a week went by without a sighting of anything unusual. There was music, soft flutes, the strum of a lyre, even the tapping of spoons on wood. These moments reminded them that while sea monsters might exist, so did friendship, and song, and hope. And when the journey ended, when the ship docked safely at a harbor, when the ropes were thrown ashore and the scent of land filled their lungs, many sailors would step onto the stone quay and kneel. Some would kiss the ground. Others would remain silent, their gaze lingering on the vast blue they had crossed, as if to say goodbye not just to the sea, but to the shadows and myths it held. These routines, these small acts of devotion and fear, tell us much about how humans cope with the unknown. The monsters may not have been real, not in the flesh and blood sense, but their presence was keenly felt. And in a world without radar, sonar, or even lighthouses, perhaps these beliefs offered the only protection sailors could truly count on. So as you drift off, imagine the quiet lapping of water against a wooden hull, the soft clink of amulets on a sailor's chest, and the hush of voices below deck. Above, the stars wheel slowly over the sea, unchanged since those ancient journeys, and far below, in the deep, the mysteries sleep on, undisturbed for now. As we continue to drift through the watery folds of ancient history, imagine yourself aboard a modest Greek merchant vessel. The salty breeze brushes against your face, and the soft creaking of wood surrounds you in a rhythm as steady as your breath. The sky above stretches endlessly, a pale dome under the golden light of a Hellenic morning. Below, the vast sea rolls on, endless, unknown, and deeply alive in the minds of those who dared to cross it. To sail the Aegean or the broader Mediterranean in the ancient world was not merely a logistical endeavor, it was a spiritual voyage. The Greeks understood the sea as a space not just of danger, but of divine will. Poseidon, the earth-shaker, ruled the oceans. Beneath his domain, other sea deities and monstrous creatures lurked, each demanding a form of respect, or perhaps appeasement. Thus, Greek sailors, fishermen, traders, explorers, and warriors alike developed a rich pattern of rituals and prayers that would accompany them on every voyage. These rites were not theatrical embellishments. They were believed to be essential protections, as real and necessary as a strong hull or sturdy sail. Before even setting sail, ceremonies might begin on land. Libations. Simple offerings of wine, oil, or honey were poured onto the ground before shrines to Poseidon or local sea deities. In larger port cities, like Piraeus or Corinth, entire temples stood to serve the spiritual needs of those who would face the sea's temperamental moods. Some captains would lead their crew in group prayers, kneeling before household altars or public shrines, asking for safe passage and calm waters. Imagine now, in a quiet dawn, the last preparations for a journey. Sailors touching their fingers to images of the gods etched on the hull, murmuring prayers to their mother's gods. A flickering oil lamp in a niche of the ship's stern, its flame swaying as if it too knew the risks ahead. Salt was sprinkled, sometimes mixed with barley, and cast overboard in quiet acts of offering, feeding the sea to satisfy its hunger. Out at sea, these spiritual acts continued. Offerings were made not only to Poseidon but to other maritime figures. Amphitrite, the wife of Poseidon, was invoked for calm. The Nereids, those gentle daughters of the sea, were whispered to for mercy. And even Triton, the conch-blowing herald of the deep, was considered a spirit not to anger. These divine beings were not always portrayed as wrathful, many were benevolent protectors, but the sea itself, their domain, remained unpredictable. Any change in the weather, any sudden swell or strange sight upon the horizon, could signal the gods' displeasure or the stirring of the deep creatures who answered to no human logic. Some vessels even carried small statues or tokens of the gods, a miniature figure of Poseidon carved from driftwood, a painted shell with symbols sacred to Aphrodite or Apollo. These tokens were thought to offer protection, like a divine eye watching over the journey. In storms, the crew might chant hymns, not to still the waves, but to calm their hearts and plead for intercession. Superstition and ritual often blended in subtle ways. Whistling was forbidden on some ships, for fear it might call up winds too strong to tame. Certain birds, like gulls or albatrosses, were seen as omens, their flight patterns watched as messages from the gods. A dolphin swimming beside a ship might bring cheers from the crew, as these creatures were thought to be sacred guides. But if a shark lingered too long beneath the hull, fear might grow in the hearts of the most seasoned sailors. In rare cases, when danger was greatest, sacrifices could be made at sea. These were typically symbolic, throwing treasured objects into the water, breaking a precious jar of oil, or burning incense and herbs upon a makeshift altar fashioned from a bronze bowl. Yet, stories do circulate of darker rites, of desperate offerings in dire storms, of animals cast into the waves in hopes of drawing attention away from the ship. These tales may be part myth, part truth, woven into the sailors' shared imagination, where survival sometimes felt like the gift of unseen hands. Even the most ordinary parts of seafaring life had rituals embedded within. Meals began with small offerings, tiny morsels dropped overboard or set aside. The naming of a new ship was a ceremony in itself, often involving prayers, garlands, and the symbolic washing of the ship's prow. This was not only tradition but a way of entering the sea's domain with humility. And when the journey ended, when sails were lowered, and feet found solid ground, thanks were given. Altars were revisited, more libations poured, and stories of the voyage shared among temple priests or family members with wide eyes and quiet relief. The sea had been kind, or at least not unkind, and that was always cause for solemn gratitude. It's easy to imagine how, on a star-filled night, a lone sailor leaning on the rail might whisper into the darkness. Not in fear, but in reverence. Asking Poseidon for fair winds. Hoping Amphitrite would calm the currents. Or offering a small prayer to a long-lost friend, now somewhere beneath the waves. For ancient Greek sailors, the sea was never just a stretch of water, it was a place of presence, of mystery, and of gods whose favor might mean the difference between returning home or not returning at all. Now, as the sea breeze softens once more, we prepare to shift our gaze inland, toward the rare moments when those who feared the sea's monsters decided to turn their legends into symbols. In our next segment, we'll explore the artistic and symbolic legacy of sea monsters in ancient Greek temples, pottery, and storytelling, a world where fear became form, and imagination found shape in stone and clay. Just let the waves of thought settle gently. As we move further into the minds and beliefs of ancient Greek sailors, we find that their sense of safety on the water was not solely dependent on charms, rituals, or even the mechanics of navigation. There was also a profound and deeply held belief in sacred geography, places on the earth and sea where the boundaries between the divine and mortal worlds blurred. For sailors, identifying these places, and acting accordingly, could be the difference between safety and peril. In this segment, we will explore how these sacred locations shaped their seafaring experience, and how invoking divine favor in key geographical contexts served as a psychological and spiritual shield against the ever-looming fears of the sea. To the Greek mind, geography was not inert. It was animated with history, myth, and divine presence. Mountains, capes, harbors, and straits were more than landforms, they were the resting places of gods, the sites of heroic acts, or the domains of monsters. Sailors approached these regions with both awe and caution. Cape Malea, for instance, located on the southeastern tip of the Peloponnese, was feared and respected in equal measure. Though not known for sea monsters in the traditional sense, it was considered cursed or haunted by ill winds. Homer's Odyssey gives us a glimpse of its reputation. Odysseus, attempting to round the cape, is blown far off course, setting in motion his 10-year voyage. Sailors believed that Malea was under the control of Poseidon or perhaps some lesser marine deity with a vengeful streak, and thus, offerings were often made at sea before attempting to round the cape. Sometimes it was a libation of wine, poured over the side, sometimes it was the silent, reverent touching of an amulet. Other landmarks, like the Strait of Messina, came with even darker associations. This narrow passage between Sicily and the Italian mainland was said to be the home of Scylla and Charybdis, the monstrous duo that posed an impossible navigational challenge in myth. To pass safely through the strait was to defy mythic odds. And so, Greek sailors devised strategies, not just of sailing, but of prayer and posture. The helmsman might keep a particular charm tied to the tiller, while a lookout recited a hymn quietly under his breath. Crossing a sacred or feared region became almost liturgical, a series of prescribed spiritual acts that mirrored and reinforced the physical ones. Islands, too, could be laden with spiritual significance. Delos, the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis, was believed to be a place of healing and clarity. Some sailors who had faced hardship or near-death experiences at sea made pilgrimages to Delos to give thanks. Others may have simply tried to steer a course close to it, hoping to catch the divine resonance of its sacred terrain as a buffer against the unknown. In this way, divine geography was mapped into nautical routes, not as practical waypoints, but as spiritual safe zones. In addition to avoiding cursed places, sailors actively sought proximity to lands or islands under the favor of protective deities. Rhodes, for example, was associated with Helios, the sun god. Many sailors viewed it as a place of light and guidance. It's not difficult to imagine how comforting the association of a bright, all-seeing deity like Helios would be for those traversing dim, uncertain waters. To sail within view of Rhodes might have felt like sailing under a celestial spotlight. Even certain ports or cities were believed to be particularly under the favor of the gods. The port of Piraeus, the gateway to Athens, was seen as a protected space thanks to the city's dedication to Athena and Poseidon. Before heading out, sailors might visit a temple in Piraeus to leave an offering or utter a prayer. Upon returning safely, many made it a point to return to that same place, sometimes bringing tokens from their journey, like a shell from a distant beach or a tiny amphora filled with foreign sand, as tribute. And then there was the sea itself, often considered a deity in its own right. While Poseidon was the ruler, sailors frequently addressed the sea directly, calling it Thalassa or Pontus, depending on dialect and context. It was not uncommon for captains to pour libations directly onto the waves before a voyage began. This act was more than symbolic, it was a way to establish harmony with the force that could just as easily cradle as consume. In addition to recognizing sacred geography, Greek sailors also studied celestial patterns and how they might reflect divine favor or disfavor. A sudden eclipse, the rising of an unusual star, or the sudden appearance of a comet could signal divine discontent. Sailors carried stories of voyages that were doomed after ignoring such signs. Even birds were read as omens. If a gull flew against the wind or circled the mast too many times, it was interpreted as a sign to return to port or delay departure. Many ships also carried effigies of gods, especially Poseidon or Athena, carved or painted on the hull, mast, or figurehead. These weren't mere decorations, they were understood to be actual sites of divine presence. The god or goddess wasn't simply represented, they were with the crew, watching, guiding, protecting, and judging. In this sense, every ship became a floating shrine, a microcosm of sacred geography unto itself. The role of sacred geography in ancient Greek seafaring was thus multifaceted. It was part navigational aid, part spiritual compass, and part psychological comfort. To sail with knowledge of the sacred was to sail with an invisible map, a map not of coastlines and currents, but of divine proximity and supernatural resonance. In moments of fear or uncertainty, sailors looked to these unseen boundaries to orient themselves, not just physically, but cosmically. As the rhythmic splash of oars echoed across the water and sails caught the breeze with gentle creaks, the knowledge that they sailed through lands known and favored by gods gave Greek sailors a measure of peace. Whether that peace translated to protection from sea monsters or simply steadied their hands at the tiller, we cannot say for sure. But for them, the sacred was a very real dimension of the sea, a silent but powerful ally in the vast and mysterious world of open water. When we return in the next segment, we'll turn from the sanctity of divine geography to the contrasting daily life of the elite. Those who commissioned ships but seldom sailed them, who feared not monsters in the deep, but disgrace in the courts and the agora. Their fears were no less real, though they took a very different form. Let us now gently drift away from sacred capes and monster-haunted straits, and begin our slow approach toward the marble-lined homes of Athens' upper class. Let's imagine again the quiet of a Greek shoreline at dusk. You're not on a ship this time, but on the pebbled edge of a small harbor. The scent of salt, tar, and olive smoke lingers in the air. Wooden boats creak softly at anchor. Farther down the coast, voices murmur low over cups of wine and firelight. The day's work has ended. Fishermen mend nets, merchants count coin, and sailors, tired, sun-worn sailors, settle into their usual rhythm of retelling. This is where the sea monster stories truly came alive. Not just in the wind-lashed moments of terror during storms or the frantic eye scanning distant horizons, but here, on dry land, when the tension eased and the imagination was free to roam. In this penultimate segment of our journey, we turn from the oceans to the coastlines. From monstrous encounters to myth-making. From the thrill of personal survival to the broader web of oral storytelling that helped these fantastic tales take root and spread far beyond the sailors who first whispered them. The Firelight Circle, the birthplace of belief. Long before scrolls and libraries, stories lived in mouths and memories. Sailors were not simply laborious. They were witnesses to the unknown. When they returned, salt-streaked and wide-eyed, the people of the village listened. Not because they believed everything, but because they wanted to believe something. A man might speak of a storm that blew his ship off course, tossing it into strange waters where the sea boiled and sang. Another might swear he saw a serpent longer than 10 oars twisting in the mist off Crete. Some spoke in low tones of islands that weren't there in the morning, or of floating lights that moved against the wind. Around the fire, with wine-loosening tongues and shadows stretching long, these tales became ritual. What began as a half-remembered squall became a warning. A fish glimpsed in deep water grew larger each time the tale was told. The frightening became sacred. And gradually, personal memory blurred into shared myth. That is how a moment of fear or awe became a legend. Oral traditions and the speed of sail. The Mediterranean wasn't just a sea, it was a highway of culture. From Athens to Alexandria, from Tyre to Syracuse, ships carried more than goods. They carried ideas. Imagine this: a Greek trader tells a tale in a port in Phoenicia. A local fisherman hears it, then repeats it days later in Cyprus. A soldier overhears, takes the tale with him back to Italy, where it shifts again in the telling. With each retelling, the story warps slightly to fit the local tongue, the regional fears, and the cultural symbolism of the people who hear it. A Greek Katos becomes a Roman Cetus. A Nereid's voice, originally a helpful warning, becomes the haunting wail of a siren. A harmless shoal becomes a shifting island guarded by spirits. Over time, even cities far from the sea knew the monsters' names. These weren't isolated campfire tales anymore. They were becoming canon, etched into collective memory, guiding maps, shaping poems, decorating temples. The role of artists and poets in cementing the lore. The poet was to ancient Greece what the broadcaster or influencer is to us today, a conveyor of imagination to the masses. And when a poet heard a sailor's tale, something magical often happened. Take Homer. His Odyssey didn't invent sea monsters, but it immortalized them. Scylla and Charybdis, the sirens, and the whirlpools were born in stories older than the text, but Homer gave them names, gave them shape, and sent them into eternity. Later poets followed suit. Hesiod catalogued monstrous sea deities in his Theogony. Euripides and Sophocles, in their tragedies, used the sea, and its terrors, as symbols of fate, punishment, and divine chaos. Even philosophers like Plato used myths of sea creatures as allegories for the unknown and the dangerous. Meanwhile, artisans decorated pottery with swirling tentacles and winged fishwomen. Mosaic floors in wealthy villas featured mighty heroes slaying sea beasts. The monsters, once glimpsed in fog and fear, had now become decorative and deeply symbolic motifs. With every amphora, every painted wall, every sung line of verse, the monsters moved farther from the lonely sailor's lips and deeper into the fabric of Greek identity. The social utility of the sea monster tale. The practical function of these stories was not lost on the people of the time. In a society with low literacy, oral storytelling helped convey warnings, map dangers, and pass along wisdom in a form that could be remembered. Children learned that wandering too far from shore meant risking the wrath of Poseidon, or being eaten by a fish the size of a house. New sailors listened closely to their elders' tales before their first voyage, internalizing not just superstition but practical fear. The monster at Cape Malea may have been just a trick of the rocks and current, but it kept ships cautious and kept them alive. Even politics used the sea monsters. Rulers who wanted to discourage commoners from venturing to certain coasts sometimes leaned into the tales. Better to let fear serve as a natural barrier than to risk rebellion or competition. A clever merchant might inflate a story to keep rivals away from a lucrative but dangerous port. The monsters were useful, and as long as they served a purpose, they would survive. The psychological route, coping with the unseen. In a more introspective sense, sea monster stories offered an outlet for anxiety. The sea, as we've explored, was not just a travel route. It was a chaotic force. Vast, mysterious, untamable. It could provide riches one week and claim dozens of lives the next. To live by the sea was to court a certain kind of uncertainty. And the human brain, then as now, sought meaning in the chaos. Giving the sea a personality and naming its dangers, imagining creatures in its depths, offered a sense of control. It turned random chance into narrative. It transformed senseless drownings into battles lost to mighty foes. And it gave survivors a way to understand their trauma. They weren't simply unlucky. They had faced the monster and lived to tell the tale. In this way, the sea monster became part of Greek mental health, in a manner of speaking. A cultural coping mechanism. Foreign influence and the cross-cultural monster. Greek sailors did not sail in a vacuum. They traded with Egyptians, who had their own Nile monsters. With Mesopotamians, who had the monstrous Tiamat. With Phoenicians, who spoke of gods of the sea deep enough to swallow ships whole. It's likely, almost certain, that stories crossed language and cultural barriers. A Greek might borrow a detail from a Phoenician myth. A Libyan fisherman might adapt a Greek tale to suit local reefs. Over generations, the monsters became pan-Mediterranean, wearing the masks of many cultures. Some gods themselves, like Poseidon, have possible non-Greek roots. He may have absorbed or merged with earlier, local deities. Likewise, sea monsters weren't purely Greek but were shaped by centuries of seafaring interaction. This cross-cultural influence helped the monsters endure. Because when the stories changed to fit many tongues, they reached many ears, and became harder to forget. A culture that needed its monsters. At the heart of it all was a simple truth. Ancient Greek culture needed its sea monsters. Not just for entertainment. Not just to explain storms. But to enrich a worldview steeped in gods, omens, and meaning. The monsters gave shape to a world that was otherwise formless. They populated the blank spaces between islands, filled the unexplored corners of the map, and gave mortals something to marvel at, or fear, in a universe ruled by divine forces. And even as science advanced, maps grew more accurate, and navigation became safer, the monsters didn't disappear. They simply evolved. Imagine, for a moment, the gentle rocking of a ship returning to harbor. The horizon no longer stretches out endlessly, but instead gives way to the familiar contours of home, jagged cliffs or sloping beaches, terracotta rooftops peeking over the land, and the comforting sounds of gulls echoing from the shore. After weeks, perhaps months at sea, a Greek sailor's return was not simply a journey's end, it was a moment filled with quiet joy, relief, and reflection. The return, a time-honored ritual. Coming home was itself a deeply meaningful ritual for ancient Greek sailors. Their return was often marked by ceremonies both personal and communal. Some would offer one final sacrifice to Poseidon, this time in gratitude for safe passage. Others might pause at small rural shrines near the coast, those simple stone altars scattered across Greece's shoreline. To leave a token of thanks. An offering of wine, oil, or even a bit of sea salt laid upon the altar as a gesture of reverence. Fishermen returning to their islands would be met by wives and children on the dock, sometimes in silence, sometimes with music. There was no great fanfare, no orchestrated ceremony. Instead, there was familiarity, the warmth of hands grasping, the soft chatter of voices, and the calm joy of returning to one's rhythms. The sea had released them once more. Stories shared around the fire. As twilight gathered over the polis or the village, sailors often shared tales of what they had seen. Around fires, they recounted not only storms and winds but creatures glimpsed in the distance, unexplainable shadows beneath the waves, glowing eyes that bobbed in the dark, and immense shapes that moved with alarming grace just beneath the surface. These stories, passed from one generation to the next, added layer upon layer to the mythic understanding of the ocean. Sometimes, they described monstrous forms. Other times, they would speak of beautiful women rising from the foam, luring men to drown with their gaze alone. Each story was embroidered with details, and each listener brought their own imagination to the picture. Thus, sea monsters did not remain fixed in appearance or behavior, they evolved with every retelling, molded by awe and memory. These tales served more than just entertainment. They reinforced cultural knowledge, passed on hard-earned wisdom, and maintained the respect necessary to survive the capricious moods of the sea. A young boy listening to his uncle speak of a shimmering serpentine creature that swam alongside their ship for days would internalize something far deeper than mere myth. He would learn fear, humility, and wonder. Harbors as transitional spaces. The harbor was more than just a physical location. It served as a psychological transition zone. It was where the sailor began to shed the mindset of the sea and re-enter the slower, more predictable cadence of land. But it could be a difficult shift. The vast ocean, with its silence and chaos, often lingered in the minds of those who sailed it. Some sailors never truly adjusted. They would wake in the middle of the night to the imagined creaking of sails or the splash of oars. Others would find themselves wandering the coast at dawn, drawn once more to the sight of the open water. It wasn't uncommon for older seafarers to take long walks by the sea, sometimes speaking to it as an old friend, sometimes merely watching the waves and remembering. This quiet reverence for the ocean extended even into how Greeks treated shipwreck victims or those lost at sea. If the body of a sailor washed ashore, it was considered a sacred duty to bury him properly, even if he was a stranger. It was believed that such souls roamed restlessly otherwise, caught between the watery world they had known and the earth to which they had not returned. The lasting influence of sea monster beliefs. Though the classical era eventually gave way to Hellenistic and Roman domination, the Greek worldview surrounding the sea and its creatures remained. Many of these ancient beliefs were absorbed and reshaped by Roman thought, reappearing in new forms in Roman bestiaries and travel accounts. Later still, during the medieval period, many Greek notions of sea creatures would be reborn in illuminated manuscripts filled with drawings of fantastic marine beasts. But the ancient Greeks did more than populate the sea with monsters. They showed how human imagination could attempt to understand and cope with the unknown. For them, the ocean was not simply a place of trade routes or wars, but a living force, one that listened, responded, and occasionally took form in the creatures people dreamed into existence. Even today, modern interpretations of ancient sea monsters remain compelling. The kraken, the siren, the leviathan, though often imagined through the lens of later European myth or science fiction, carry echoes of earlier Greek visions. Each time we imagine a shadow moving beneath the surface or hear tales of deep-sea mysteries, we participate in a tradition older than we realize. Sea monsters in Greek art and daily life. The legacy of sea monster belief also lived in Greek art and domestic life. Vases, mosaics, and frescoes often featured stylized depictions of marine beasts. Some were clearly drawn from imagination, serpents with horse heads, dolphins with wings, but others hinted at real animals viewed through the lens of mystery. Such art was not merely decorative. It reflected how deeply these beliefs were embedded in society. A vase showing Odysseus tied to the mast as Siren circle his ship was not just a mythological scene, it was a warning, a memory, a mirror. It reminded all who saw it of the temptations and dangers of the sea, and the importance of caution, cleverness, and courage. In homes near the shore, it was not uncommon to find small tokens, figurines of dolphins or clay fish, used as protective charms. Some households even placed these on boats before launching, believing they could ward off sea monsters or guide the ship to safety. In temples, sea creature imagery sometimes adorned walls or columns, subtly connecting the worship of gods like Poseidon and Amphitrite to the real fears and hopes of daily life. Passing into memory. As centuries passed, many ancient Greek harbors fell silent. Earthquakes shifted coastlines. Wars reshaped empires. Old temples crumbled into the sea. But the stories lingered. They became part of oral tradition, then literature, then legend. Greek sailors may be long gone, but their questions remain: what lies beneath the waves? What shape does fear take in the dark? And how do we protect ourselves from what we cannot see? In many ways, their methods, charms, prayers, stories, remain ours too. Though the monsters we imagine today may look different, the instincts are the same. We seek patterns. We look for meaning. We try to soothe our anxiety with tales of those who survived before us. So as the last Greek ship of our journey returns to harbor, and the sound of the sea grows faint behind us, we're left not with answers, but with a sense of timeless curiosity. The sea still whispers to those who listen. And in its depths, real or imagined, something ancient stirs. As we bring our voyage to a close, let the waves of history settle gently around your thoughts. We've journeyed across a world not just of seas and ships, but of stories, woven with fear, reverence, and curiosity. The Greek sailor of antiquity did not simply chart courses across water, they navigated oceans of superstition, culture, and deeply held beliefs about the mysteries beneath them. From the humble offerings cast into the waves before departure, to the elaborate prayers etched into the timbers of their vessels, sailors in the ancient world rarely sailed alone. They were joined by gods and spirits, myths and monsters, rituals and charms, all silently tucked into their daily lives, unseen, but no less powerful than oars or sails. We trace the fearful awe of the unknown depths, where stories of Scylla and Charybdis, Catos, and the sea serpent entwined with maps and minds. We lingered among altars at harbor temples, heard whispered prayers under stormy skies, and walked through the marketplaces where amulets changed hands with quiet urgency. But we also glimpsed resilience. Despite their fears, Greek sailors pressed forward, rowing through fog, storm, and superstition. Whether they truly believed the sea was filled with monsters, or simply respected its unpredictability, they took comfort in tradition, in myth, in the ancient memory passed down in lullabies and legends. And now, as the past gently recedes like the tide, imagine the gentle rocking of a ship, far from shore, beneath a sky flecked with stars. The sailor leans back, listening to the creak of the wood and the splash of waves, perhaps fingering a small charm around his neck, or murmuring a prayer to Poseidon. The sea is still wide. The myths are still deep. But tonight, you are safe, far from the monsters, wrapped in the warmth of history's stories and the steady rhythm of time. Sleep well, traveler of ages past. Let the winds of the ancient world carry you softly into dreams.